Okay, everyone, I'd like to get started if we could. Do we have both of our remote participants on the line? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Cheryl Miller, and I am the Director of International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Verizon. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this panel here today. I'm also very thankful for the remarks by Assistant Secretary Strickling and Ambassador Sepulveda that have led up to this panel. It was very kind of them. Last time I checked, we have over 500 participants for this conference, which is really great. And I'm not sure how many we have online, but we have many online as well. And so we had a really great turnout, and we're very excited. We're all looking forward to having some really valuable discussions here in DC as we prepare for the global IGF that's going to be taking place in September. Net neutrality is clearly an important topic under discussion in a variety of different global forums in Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and North America. We are fortunate to have with us today a variety of speakers who are focused on the global conversations that are occurring, and I want to thank my colleague at Microsoft, Mike Nelson, for helping to bring everyone here together today. I also want to take advantage of this unique opportunity, and rather than focus on the U.S. developments, I'd like us to really engage in a dialogue about what is taking place elsewhere. To that end, I'm going to ask that the audience absorb some of the international case studies that our panelists have prepared for us today, and to tailor your questions to further flesh out the dialogue on the global net neutrality policy discussions. While there are many different definitions of the term net neutrality, the values and practices of an open internet are widely shared. The challenge that many governments are grappling with today is measuring to what extent an open internet requires formal legislation or regulations. Typically, we see a push to impose stringent rules where there is some example of a market failure or a problem that could potentially impact a consumer's ability to get or to receive the content that they desire. With this in mind, I'd like to jump right in and introduce our panel. We have on the line Yves Blondil, who is the Managing Director of T-Regs. We have in the room with us Jeffrey Campbell, the Vice President of the Americas of Global Government Affairs for Cisco Systems. We also have on the line Grace Githaiga of Kenya's ICT Action Network, and Andrew McDermott with us here from the Center for Democracy and Technology, one of their senior policy analysts in the room. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be alternating between our in-person participants and our remote participants here. So with that, I'd like you each to take a few minutes to introduce yourselves and your work, and also just dive in with the first question. So first question to start with, based on what you see in the different countries that you are covering, what do you see, what case studies can you share, and what is the definition of net neutrality from your point of view as you look at these different regions or countries that you're going to speak about today?
Thanks, Cheryl. Hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Campbell with Cisco. I handle our government affairs and regulatory policy for the Western Hemisphere here, and I have I've had the pleasure and the pain of working on this issue for 12 years now, actually. In fact, I was one of the individuals that was involved in drafting the first original principles around openness in the internet way back in the original FCC proceeding back in 2002, 2003. And so I've watched the issue grow and develop over the years, morph into some very interesting areas, and also spread around the world. So rather than talk about what's going on here in the US that people are very familiar with, we thought we would, as a panel, do much more of a tour of the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about countries like Brazil and Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. No, that is not a list of countries that were unable to defeat the Germans in the World Cup. and I don't have the secret to how to solve that. But briefly, I wanted to touch on a couple of things about what's been going on in some of these countries. I'm going to start with Brazil, the largest and most influential Latin American country at this point in time. Brazil recently passed its Marco Civil, which included a significant number of legal changes with respect to the internet in particular, including net neutrality. This was hurriedly passed by the Congress on the run-up to the Net Mundial conference and was pushed forward very aggressively by the leaders in the Brazilian government in the wake of some of the revelations about government surveillance and other things that have been going on. The Brazilian law is perhaps the most strict and stringent net neutrality law, on paper at least, around the world. Right now, we just have the text of the law. The regulations have not been adopted yet, and there's a process going on for doing that. But essentially, the law is very limited. It basically says that, transmission, switching, and routing entities must treat any data traffic the same way, without distinction related to content, origin, destination, service, terminal, or applications. Any discrimination or degradation of traffic is prohibited according to regulation unless due to technical requirements for adequate service provision. So basically what the law is saying is you can't do anything but send traffic through unless you're doing something that is related to providing your service provision. We'll see how this gets written out in rules, but I think this will be our example for probably the most restrictive market in the world in terms of what opportunities ISPs have to do to differentiate traffic or offer new services going forward, and we'll have to see where that goes. Just a minute on Chile. Chile was the first Latin American country to adopt net neutrality legislation. They did it in July 2010. It was overwhelmingly approved by a unanimous vote in the parliament that was there. The focus at that point was on issues relating to blocking and to traffic differentiation, and was finally implemented in regulations by the regulator in Chile, and essentially is a no blocking rule jurisdiction with very strong limitations on how traffic can be differentiated within the country. What's very interesting there is some of the ISPs have recently come out with offerings, particularly mobile operators, have come out with offerings that have provided 0 ratings for certain applications like Facebook, where in essence it's not counting against your bit limits or your bit pricing on that front. And technically, that is not permitted under the regulation, and the regulator came out and began addressing this and asking the operators to stop those offerings going forward. That created quite a public outroar in Chile. For the first time, we've seen an actual reaction against net neutrality regulation on the basis of the view that the consumer choice was being limited in these situations where consumers liked the 0 rating options, wanted to have them, and have forcefully pushed back on the regulator on that front. The regulator's now backpedaling a little and discussing about exactly what they mean when they say you can't have any differentiation according to traffic here. Stay tuned for this space, because I think it's probably the first jurisdiction around the world where we're actually seeing a backlash against some of stricter applications of net neutrality rules. And very briefly, lastly, I would mention Colombia, which has produced what I would call a more modest and moderate net neutrality regime that was passed there. It was passed very quietly in the country with very little discussion, very little opposition. It does have blocking prohibitions. You can't block traffic or can't block content. You can manage networks and you can maintain the security of the networks. You can also offer differentiated services, including limited services or services that serve only some market segments or provide better service to other market segments. But the ISPs are also required to offer an alternative plan that offers all services and unlimited services, giving consumers a choice between that and the other offerings that they offer. This seems to be the choice model, where you have the ability of ISPs to innovate with things as long as they have a baseline offering that give consumers the choice to go into a new differentiated offering or to stay with the old standard access to everything and no differentiation in traffic to everything offer that's out there. It seems to be working reasonably well in its implementation. I think that's my 5 minutes. I'll come back on what I think net neutrality is about later.
Okay, thank you so much. Can we please switch to Yves, one of our remote participants? Is he there? I don't know. It'd be great if we can pull him up on the screen.
Can we move on to the next speaker? Is that possible?
Skip order? Sure. Why don't we next then turn to Andrew? Andrew and Yves, they're both touching on Europe in different ways, and so just keep that in mind in terms of the order. We're going to go out of order for a second. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to. In some ways, I think it made a little bit of sense for Yves to go first, but I'll do my best. So I am Andrew McDermott. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I, too, have been working on net neutrality for many years, I guess about half as long as Jeff, for about last 6 years since I've been at CDT. CDT had been involved in the debates before I got there, and as it started, sort of 08, 09, 2010, our focus was very heavily on the US. We sort of engaged deeply with the FCC, offering comments and sort of principles and guidance on what we thought meaningful rules ought to look like. And one of my roles after the sort of first round at the FCC, or I guess, eighth round, if now is the ninth, after the 2010 rules came out, was to sort of take that up a level and offer principles sort of in recognition that this is not, it's very clearly not a US issue, that the internet is global and that lots of countries are dealing with the same issues, and so sort of blowing it up to a level of principles to offer our perspective on what meaningful net neutrality protection should look like. So to that end, as part of the IGF Dynamic Coalition on net neutrality, we offered a paper last fall framing net neutrality issues within the human rights context that I was the lead author of. And I thought I'd start sort of ticking through some of those principles and then talk about what we're hoping to see come out of the European process. I think Yves is going to provide a little more background on this existing state of legislation and regulation in Europe. My view is a little bit more forward-looking, what we'd like to see out of the current legislative process. So in terms of defining net neutrality, I mean, to me, it's fundamentally concerned with preserving an internet that empowers user choice and sort of wide access to a diverse array of information sources on the internet, and that puts users in control of what services they choose to access, what content they choose to publish, what content they choose to access. And it's very much an innovation policy argument that net neutrality preserves a relatively level playing field for communications tools at the edges of the networks to launch new services, to access customers all over the world, potential customers all over the world. It's concerned with preserving what I see as four sort of fundamental characteristics of the internet as we have known it. That it is global. Once you're connected, you have access to everyone else who's connected. That it is user-controlled. More so than other media, it offers diverse content and services and affords the opportunity for users to sort of create their own experience. You choose what you do, you choose what you read, you choose what you say. It is decentralized. There's no single party that controls access to the network and dissemination of content on the network. And it's open and competitive. It provides low barriers to entry, relatively. again, once you connect as an innovator, sort of on the edge of the network, you can launch any new communications service to a global audience potentially, without negotiating individually with carriers around the world. So that's sort of framing what I view as we're trying to preserve with net neutrality rules. And as Eve will talk about, there is sort of an existing framework in Europe that offers national regulatory agencies the ability to create rules if necessary, and we've seen examples in the Netherlands and in Slovenia based on that framework of net neutrality laws. And there's a current debate going on. The European Parliament passed a new regulation in April that's currently being debated at the European Council to mandate stricter net neutrality protection in law for European states. It has been the subject of a huge debate. There was a strong series of net neutrality-friendly amendments adopted with that vote in April. And that, among some other pieces of the legislation dealing with, it's a much broader piece of legislation that covers other telecom issues such as roaming and spectrum and all sorts of other things. So there's a lot there. Net neutrality is actually a relatively small piece of it. But in the wake of the passage in April, I think like Jeff was saying, I think about Brazil, was viewed by many of the telco operators as being more restrictive and more complicated and more of a burden than I think is necessary. And so part of our goal, working through our European office, I and my colleague David Sohn as the substantive leads on net neutrality, working with our European representative, is to articulate what we think is sort of middle ground way forward is on net neutrality. And sort of to that end, we've articulated some of the sort of key features we'd like to see. And this applies in the US as well. We've been spending a lot of time making these arguments to the FCC over the last few weeks, few months. And so those features are, I think, you want to see a basic assumption, basic presumption against blocking and against discrimination in what we would consider basic internet access service. You know, there should be, the baseline expectation is that internet access providers should not be playing favorites, picking winners and losers, and choosing for their customers what is and isn't available. At the same time, we don't view net neutrality as requiring prohibitions on all enhanced forms of delivery. There should be flexibility for specialized services, for carriers to innovate with business models, make partnerships where enhanced quality of service may be required.
To restrict the internet and, of course, the entire debate.
Testing Skype, good. I think there are two main elements to crafting room for specialized services. First, we want a requirement that a specialized service is truly specialized in the sense of creating specific limited purpose access to a targeted range of content instead of the sort of all internet endpoints view. And second, that there be a requirement of a substantial degree of logical separation on the wires so that the offering of specialized services does not eat into or eat into too far the offering of internet access service. So that is a core part of our advocacy. I think there's some reasonable opinion that the approach to specialized services in the European regulation is not quite on point and is not quite flexible enough. Another key issue is, and I actually want to raise this as a question to Jeff with respect to Colombia, is ongoing oversight to ensure that as carriers offer specialized services on one hand and internet access service on the other, what is the role for regulators? What is the rule to prevent the sort of starvation of the baseline service? Free choice between a specialized model and a plain vanilla internet access, I think, is worthy of discussion, but we want to make sure that the incentives aren't structured so that carriers can starve the one in favor of the other. So that really is a free choice.
Thank you, Andrew.
Are we over time? I've got a couple more points, but I'm happy to defer to.
If we can just get through everyone,
Okay.
and then we'll definitely have time. Okay.
Great.
Is Eve available?
We're going to play a video of Eve.
Okay.
will actually be on what is in force today in Europe. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the IGF today. I was asked to discuss Europe, in particular the European Union and perhaps its member states. My focus will actually be on what is in force today in Europe. And that is because I think it's important to tell an audience outside of Europe that Europe does have legislation in force regarding open internet and neutrality at this time. There's also an active debate about enhancing and further harmonizing that regulation, but that is not the focus of my talk today. So what's in force? 2 directives adopted in 2009 and transposed in the national law of the member states around 2011. First, in the Framework Directive, a principal objective has been added to the objectives of the national regulatory authorities. And that objective, which is in the context of promoting the interests of citizens, is to promote the ability of end users to access and distribute information or run applications and services of their choice. You will see that the word internet is not mentioned there, but you can consider that to be implicit because the recitals to the directive do refer to the internet, and of course the entire debate was about the internet. So that's the principal level in the Framework Directive. Then in the other directive, which is the Universal Service and Users' Rights Directive, further modifications were made, and basically 3 blocks. Block 1 is contracts. When a telecom operator makes a contract with a customer, they are now required to include in that contract any conditions that may limit access to and or use of services and applications. So the customer needs to be informed about limitations that may be applied. It goes further because the second block there is subscriber information and concerns specifically a change to a contract after the contract has been entered into. So if a telecom operator would wish to change its terms and conditions in a way that would limit access and or use of services and applications, then it should inform its customer of that fact, and in fact it should also permit the customer to cancel the contract if they don't agree with a change that is seen as detrimental to them. The second part in the same article is to provide information about procedures that a telecom operators put in place to shape traffic, and shaping traffic is contextualized here as in a context of avoiding filling or overfilling a network link, and then there's a requirement of explaining how such procedures could impact service quality. The last block in the EU directive, Universal Service and Users' Rights Directive, is a power and kind of a residual power for national regulatory authorities to impose minimum quality of service. Clearly, this concerns minimum quality of service for the internet portion of a connection, and clearly this has been determined in the context of concerns about the so-called dirt road. I emphasize immediately that to date, no national regulatory authority has actually used such powers, and that's actually a parameter in the debate because some say that the powers are unenforceable in essence. Now, that was the EU directives. What have the member states done? Most, nearly all of them, have simply cut and pasted the text of the EU directive in their national law, perhaps with a small modification here and there. But there are 2 member states who have gone further, and we were permitted to go further. Those member states are the Netherlands and Slovenia. I will not go into detail now, but in a debate that could clearly be a topic for discussion. There's one last thing, is that there is also a European Commission declaration on net neutrality that was added to the package of EU directives. That declaration is non-binding, but it's basically the key authority that expresses its commitment to net neutrality. I could also discuss France, UK, and other countries if desired. Now, just flashing forward for a moment, why is further regulation on the table in the EU? I think first, to counteract fragmentation of open internet and net neutrality rules. And it's not a secret that the Dutch EU commissioner in charge of telecoms and internet policy has openly criticized her own country for going further in its national law than in an EU directive. And I just told you about Slovenia having done that as well. So there is a concern that we should not fragment open internet and net neutrality regulation within the EU because that could have detrimental effects. The second reason, very important, is that BEREC, that's the body of all the national telecom regulators, and the European Commission have in 2012 conducted a traffic management practices investigation. So they sent a questionnaire to telecoms operators with quite some detail, asking them whether they have contractual restrictions on certain types of internet use, whether they have technical restrictions on certain types of internet use, etc. And the chart that is being displayed showed that in 2009 there was actually quite a lot going on there. And I think many at the time were surprised about how much was going on. If you look in the middle of the chart, you can see that we're basically not far from half all of European mobile customers were at that time affected by some kind of contractual or technical restriction on the use of voice over IP. If you move to the left side of the chart, you see peer-to-peer being addressed, quite a bit of restriction even on fixed networks as well. And if you go to the right of the chart, you see blocking and throttling of other specific traffic. Now, that document is not just this chart, so I encourage everyone to look closely at the entire document and not just at this chart. But in summary, why is net neutrality back on the agenda in Europe? To counteract fragmentation, and because practices that have been seen as controversial have actually been found to be quite widespread. I have two more slides which I will not present, but which can be used for the debate, and those slides basically discuss the fact that on the 11th of September 2013, the European Commission came with a new legislative proposal which has this harmonizing effect and which has this enhancing effect on open internet and net neutrality regulation. It is also a text which introduces the concept of specialized services. Now that text was then submitted to the European Parliament on the one hand and to the Council of Ministers, which is all the member states on the other hand. The European Parliament has concluded its first reading and has actually changed the text very considerably. First of all, it introduced a definition of net neutrality, which Europe has not had to date. And secondly, it made major changes to both definitions of internet access, including a concept of net neutrality, and the definition of specialized services, which was also considerably changed. And a number of further provisions are clearly there, which I cannot discuss in such a short presentation. That's the European Parliament, which had a first reading vote. The thing is that the European Council, the Council of Ministers, the Member States, are far less advanced in examining the file, and in fact both the European Parliament and the Council need to agree on the text for it to become legislation. So although there have been considerable developments at the Parliament level, the discussion is in full swing at the Council level, and that means in practice that pretty much everything is up for grabs, and that's why all the lobbyists, all the activists, etc., are very busy meeting national delegations to seek to either take away what has been introduced or to add further to what has been introduced, and the debate is very active. And I also wish you an active and pleasant debate. Thanks.
Are we able to next switch to Grace? She's not available, or? Okay. Well, while you work on that, I'm going to go ahead and ask another question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions as well, if we could. I know earlier today we heard Ambassador Sepulveda also talk about creating sort of an environment that would allow us to expand broadband access, infrastructure, and services. And pulling from that question, I'd like you to address, to what extent do you think the existence of choice and competition would influence the net neutrality debate?
Well, it's It's an interesting question because for a number of years, the view in Europe, to use that as an example, was that because of the extensive EU regulation of service level competition that had created an enormous number of resellers of telecom services, of internet access in Europe in a highly competitive market, that the competition in the provision of internet access was sufficient to deal with any questions of whether there would be. Somebody's calling.
Perhaps that's.
In the issue of net neutrality related issues. And I think the European Commission stood on that for a significant period of time from that point of view. I think that on some of the baseline questions regarding net neutrality, the questions of whether you're going to block content, whether people are going to have access to all the content and applications of their choosing, that seems more fundamental and of importance regardless of the competitiveness of the market. I think when you see stronger competition, the ability for anti-competitive activity goes way down because market forces are likely to discipline any bad actors that are out there in the marketplace. So I think it has an important impact, but politically I think what we have learned is that it does not necessarily prevent people from moving forward with regulation in that space, and I think Europe is the perfect example.
Right. I would agree with that. I mean, the data that Eve referred to shows evidence of significant discriminatory practice among competitive European ISPs. I would also point out my former colleague Alyssa Cooper, and now Jeff's colleague at Cisco, Alyssa Cooper, did her PhD dissertation studying differences between the US with a relatively non-competitive environment for retail ISPs to the UK, where they have an open access rule and competitive ISPs on BT's infrastructure, and similarly found that there was in fact significantly more discriminatory practices in the UK example. And to me, I think competition can be helpful. It can reduce some of the pressures and the likelihood for anti-competitive behavior, but it doesn't fully solve the issue because you still have one, once you've selected, even if you have freer choice among more ISPs, you still have that one bottleneck that controls your experience. And the view from the other side of the network, somebody launching a service still may have to negotiate with that provider in order to get access to those customers. And so I don't think it removes all of the potential problems that we'd see.
So just really quickly to piggyback on that, what do you see as some of the open issues, I suppose, that are sort of left with respect to tech policy and the discussion? And just in tying this to the broader IGF, how do you see the role of the multi-stakeholder model in addressing some of these issues? I know in the United States we have what's called the BTAG, the Broadband Internet Technical Advisory Group, and they do some work related. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts would be on that.
Well, I think in terms of open issues, I think one area that gets a certain amount of discussion but is really not developed in the market yet, and depending on how the rules go, may or may not be allowed to develop in the market, is the question of providing quality of service or what some people call prioritization for traffic on the internet. I'll point out I don't know what our technical difficulties with our connections are today or aren't today, but it's possible that it's a quality of service issue. That when you want to have real-time live audio-visual connectivity, when you are doing certain things, how and when the packets arrive matter. When you are doing other things, how and when the packets arrive is less important. And there are, the IETF has created a whole set of protocols for dealing with this that largely are unimplemented. So we don't really know what would be, what the market would look like with the availability of such things. I think most of the ISPs are afraid to deploy them. Personally, I think that we can deploy them in a way that will provide better service to consumers, more choices to consumers, without having anti-competitive results. But obviously, they could be implemented in a way that would be anti-competitive, and I think that is an important role for regulators to think about, as opposed to banning the technology and not allowing applications to develop and services develop, but to think about how to deploy them in a way that provides benefits to consumers and doesn't harm competition. And I think that is the biggest open item here. I think it is discussed the least. And I think that the descent of the debate into bumper sticker tags like fast lanes and slow lanes, which can't even exist on the internet the way that it exists today, really pulls the debate away from the difficult open questions that are still out there. Bringing in groups like BitTag, where you have technical experts discussing these questions, I think is a brilliant idea. I wish it were my idea, but it wasn't. And is a way to ensure that we're getting some of the best minds that understand the technology, how networks work, how the internet works, what's possible, wrapped around questions of what is the best way to deploy this technology for the betterment of all, that provides better experience and more choice.
Yeah, I would agree that prioritization and the different categories, different ways you might prioritize are certainly a hot issue in the US and in Europe. What does it mean to prioritize? Is it necessarily zero sum in the sense that prioritizing some content is deprioritizing others? Another one I would flag that I mentioned before is defining specialized services. I believe it is possible, but the question is, how do you define specialized services so that there is flexibility for innovation in quality of service products on the part of carriers, but that sort of exception from openness doesn't swallow the rule of non-discrimination? You know, how do you determine what is a specialized service and what the ongoing balance and relationship between those data services and open internet services are? Another one I would flag is interconnection, which is, I think, getting a lot of attention in the US, but we've seen arguments in Europe also, particularly a couple years ago connected with the WICET process. We saw lots of arguments from European telcos for sending party pays being mandated in the telecommunications, international telecommunications regulations. I think interconnection has been a competitive market, working very well without government regulation, but there appear to be some tensions. You know, we get sort of a war of words from both sides. So I think that's an issue. And the last I would say is pricing and zero rating, sort of ways that could be considered discriminatory if a customer feels that they're being steered toward one service that is in some way inferior to one they would choose otherwise, but also could create lower cost options and could spur demand for services that could fund infrastructure deployment, particularly in the developing world. So those are the three that I would highlight.
Thank you. I'd like to next, if we don't have Grace, or was she able to? Okay, I'd like to next open it up to questions from the audience. I will say it is extremely bright, and so it's really hard to see those of you in the back row. So if you have a question, just sort of stand up and let us know, and we'll come around with the mic to you. We have one up front.
Hi, I'm Mike Wendy with Media Freedom. I just had a question for Andrew. How do you promote infrastructure deployment? How do you incent that in these strict net neutrality regimes that you're talking about?
Short answer is I don't know. I mean, it's one of the hardest questions that we're dealing with. You know, I'll say that we are planning a roundtable at IGF in Istanbul on the subject of zero rating, in part to get at those questions, because we recognize there could be a development benefit to that kind of relationship and that kind of arrangement, but it also gives us some pause coming at it from the lens of our net neutrality advocacy. I do not work a lot on infrastructure investment and development, and so the short answer is I don't know, but I recognize that it's an important question.
Thank you. David McCauley with Bloomberg BNA. Jeff and Andrew, I ask you to clarify something. I heard the talk about specialized services, and then I think I heard you, Jeff, say that fast lanes and slow lanes are not possible. I think you were saying technically possible. Could you talk a little bit more about specialized services vis-a-vis fast lanes? Are they the same thing? Are they different, or what?
Well, yes, this is this may take a minute or two, but I think it's a worthwhile discussion. Which is, let me start with what happens on the actual internet and the connections that we happen to have today. Which is, as data is coming along, the bits are coming along, they hit routers at various positions in the network, and one of two things happens. Either there's no congestion, all the traffic goes through the router, is routed on to where it goes and continues forward. No issue. It doesn't matter whether you're a specialized service, ordinary basic internet access traffic, best efforts traffic, doesn't matter. It's all going through. If you have congestion, the way it is ordinarily handled is that that packets are randomly dropped in order to deal with the congestion, because the router can't handle all the traffic, and it randomly drops some packets. And somebody who's using a service or trying to receive stuff that doesn't receive stuff will send back to the source, I didn't get it, it'll get resent, sometimes in milliseconds, maybe in seconds, but with some delay, and goes through. And that's what we experience, when you're on the web today, that's what you're experiencing. You can use things like quality of service markers or prioritization markers, which tell the router not to drop these packets, drop other packets. Doesn't tell you what other packets to drop, but don't drop these, to keep them through because they're time sensitive for some application that has time sensitivity. The question on fast lanes and slow lanes is the notion of, well, by marking some things to always go through, does that mean that the chance of other things having worse service increases? Statistically, it's certainly true. But in terms of the impact of the services offering, it is not likely that you're going to have a noticeable impact on the other services that are out there, because they were suffering from the random packet dropping of congestion anyway. So it's not like there's going to be one lane here where people are going fast and one lane here where people are going slow. There is one connection. It's the connection to your home or the wireless connection you have. It has a certain amount of bandwidth, and it's connected via routers to capacity that is unchanged, that's out there. The question is, in a specialized service or a prioritized service, are you doing something to it to ensure that that one is going to come through on time? And so I think that is the debate that we need to have, and I think Andrew made the point earlier, which the question is, what kind of impact does that have on other traffic or not? We haven't really implemented this in a significant enough way to know for sure. But I think if you live in a world where things that you know are time sensitive get marked and things that aren't, you're probably providing much better service than in a world where everything is just randomly dealt with.
Right. I think that's a great answer, actually. And the only thing I would add is I think it gets easier, and one thing that we've never posed is, I think it comes down to the question of who decides, right? If the customer has the ability to say, I am a gamer, I watch a lot of video, I use Skype all the time, and I'd like to specify to my ISP, these are the ones that I want not to get dropped. I think it's much less of an issue than if it is commercial deals that limit customer choice instead of empowering customer choice in terms of making the decision for what gets prioritized. And the thing I would add, again, back to the sort of zero-sum point, is in a congested state, prioritizing some packets does deprioritize others. Opening up new interconnection points doesn't necessarily do that, provided there's no sort of arbitrage manipulation of, routing things to congested points to force people into deals. And so I think that's another dimension of the fast lane, slow lane. Are there ways that sort of lift all boats, or is it all necessarily sort of a trade-off between one service and another?
Just one little final point on that, and it depends on what the other traffic that is being impacted. If it's your web browsing or your email, or maybe even a cached video stream, you won't notice the difference there. But if it is something that is also that is unprioritized real-time video or something that requires real-time service, that could be impacted.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I see one on the right.
So I was wondering to what extent you view net neutrality as a security issue if customers around the world or organizations start developing new countermeasures to sort of hide their traffic and circumvent specialized services or deprioritization measures, and what impact do you think that could have beyond the sort of narrowest net neutrality debates we're having now?
That's a really good question.
I'm going to let you go first.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate that. No, well, starting from a legalistic point of view in terms of the rules and regulations that exist in various places, almost every rule or law on this area has exceptions for security of the network, dealing with spam, issues like that. So from a position of an ISP trying to secure their networks and protect their users, there does seem to be, even under some of the strictest rules that are out there, pretty good flexibility for them to act on security-related threats on that front. Now, I think what's deeper in your question is this notion of whether if more and more traffic is encrypted and people are trying to hide where their traffic is going, you know, what is that going to, how will that operate in a prioritized world or whatnot? Well, you can mark encrypted traffic to be prioritized if you are part of a service that is allowing that to occur. So if your video connection is encrypted, that doesn't mean that the packets themselves can't be handled with some sort of quality of service on it or not. And so depending on how the users choose to deal with that, I don't think that it should inhibit the ability of the network to provide that kind of service should it be allowed and should people choose to use it. But the more people want to hide themselves, probably the more difficult it is going to be for them to avail themselves of the benefits of such services.
Right. It is a very interesting question, and one I don't feel fully equipped to answer. But I think what we wouldn't want to see is, and this gets back to the sort of who decides point, in a world where carriers are making sort of router level prioritization decisions based on the kind of traffic that they see and the kind of markings that they see. What do they do if they see something encrypted or something that they don't recognize? This is a service flow that we can't identify, so we don't know if it needs priority or not. And I wouldn't want to see a world in which, because of the incentives set up by the ability to offer prioritized service, that unrecognized or unencrypted traffic is automatically degraded, or degraded with respect to other services. I know it's not really a direct answer to your question, but it's something that occurred to me while Jeff was talking. So,
Thank you. Do we have any questions from any of our remote participants? I just wanted to check on that. Okay. Any other questions in the room? I see some on this side.
Thanks. With respect to quality of service, especially at the interconnection points, two comments. Number one, I'd like to challenge the notion that we haven't seen congestion. In fact, we have seen, and there are well-documented cases of congestion being specifically used as a business leverage and a weapon to force commercial deals. These are documented. So a carrier will not upgrade a settlement-free peering connection in the hopes of forcing a paid transit connection. Secondly, the idea that quality of service is not a zero-sum game, or that deprioritization is not a problem, I think is wrong. We see that in peering establishments, when you prioritize some traffic, you by nature have to deprioritize other traffic. Really just a comment.
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm not sure I agree with either conclusion, or at least I don't agree with them totally. With respect to the question of handling traffic interconnection, those are and have always been commercially, privately negotiated agreements. Now, how people choose to continue to negotiate in that realm may be subject to the question of whether there are issues that impact competition law. But to say that changed circumstances should not allow providers to think differently about their contractual arrangements with other providers would essentially mean that we're going to choose to regulate this entire area that has not been regulated before. And I know some people do favor that. But I think that it is rather strong to say that the actions of ISPs in those cases were solely aimed at extracting a rent. It may have been in bearing a cost. And remember, the internet, despite the fact that people like to think the internet is free, the internet is not free. Somebody has to pay for it. It's usually the end user consumer that pays for it. And we should be living in a world where the people who are causing costs are paying for the costs that they're causing. On the prioritize, deprioritize point, I agree with what you said from a pure technical point of view, that if 10% of traffic is now receiving quality of service and you have congestion, the packets that drop have to come from the other 90%, which statistically increases the chance of any other packet being dropped. Absolutely true. But what will also be true is that a lot of that traffic is non-time sensitive traffic, whether it's web browsing or email or file transfer or whatever. And so its, quote, deprioritization has no impact on the user. And I think that's an issue that is not fully understood, because we haven't really implemented this to see what the results would be. But recognizing that there's going to be a congestion burden on something, and it just strikes me that it is better to put the burden on non-time sensitive applications than on time sensitive applications, and applying quality of service is one way of doing that.
Yeah, I certainly agree that we don't want to see a prioritized, deprioritized situation. And with respect to the interconnection fight, I think I agree, again, that if that is what's going on, that is a huge problem. I mean, we don't want to see a world where there is anti-competitive manipulation of interconnection points in order to extract payments from those who wish to interconnect. I have not looked through all of the evidence that I've seen. I've sort of seen some of the arguments, most of the public arguments on either side, and I think that the stage that we're at is to sort of call for transparency and closer examinations of really what's going on, because I don't think we have all the facts in terms of what was the nature of the relationship prior to the conflict. But I do agree with you that if that's what's going on, that is a problem.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? And when you do, Stan, if you could, or take the mic, if you could just let us know, who you're with, that would be great.
Hi, Bill Check with NCTA. Just one comment that it was interesting in the last couple of weeks. There have been a number of different studies put out on this whole interconnection issue, Net Forecast, MIT. The MIT study was particularly interesting in that it was showing that the potential for congestion was really coming about or possible by the decisions made by content providers and the paths that they took in transferring the data across the networks.
Did either of you want to respond, or?
Well, I mean, I think that's right. That's the argument that we see counter to the content providers' arguments that it was a refusal to upgrade interconnection points. that caused the problems. But again, arguments on each side could be a problem either way. I think transparency is the call for now.
Thank you. Are there other questions? We've got time. Yeah, right up there.
Yeah, I'm Luciano from Ministry of Industry in Brazil. And I want to know if you are thinking about who will decide what is priority. Because in the technical side, the application can say that to the Internet Protocol that my application is a priority. But if this is true, almost everybody that develops an application will do this. My application is the priority. If the internet service provider choose the traffic, they will have the power to decide. Are you having some discussions about how to set a priority based on the application or what is going on in the line?
Yeah, that is a very good question. It's sort of like if everybody is on the highway and they get to decide that they are the person who should go fastest, and everyone would say that it is themselves. This is an area where I think there are benefits to market forces, and there is a cost to providing quality of service. That is an investment in the network and the operation of the network that would have to be made by the ISPs. And so presumably they're unlikely to be willing to implement this without getting some revenue for the cost that's there. And so making it something that people choose to pay for is a good way of starting to identify whether there's value there or not. If I care that the packets are arriving in time, for my application, I should be, or the offering of the application, may be willing to pay for that. And if they're not willing to pay for that, then that's fine. They'll get the same best efforts internet that they've always had. But I think that's a good way to deal with the tragedy of the commons question that you raise, which is everything would be marked priority, in which case it doesn't matter, nothing's priority.
Yeah. The only thing I would add again is the incentives point, that we don't want to see the market for priority swallow the market for open internet access. So that carriers invest in the solely, or not solely, but heavily in the provision of the ability to offer priority at the expense of services, sort of the open internet model that we have today.
Thank you. So we'll take this as a last question and then let the panelists have the last word.
Oh, thank you. So Eric Berger from Georgetown University, question for the panelists, and actually anyone in here who's got experience as an ISP. So the protocols in the IETF to do quality of service have just had their 17th birthday, 17 years old. And I'm glad you brought up economics. Has any ISP anywhere in the world gotten more benefit or revenue or better quality of service for an investment in quality of service compared to the cost of deploying it? So far, my understanding is the answer is no, that as you try to implement quality of service, it ends up resulting in much worse service for everybody, not just the people who are not paying for it, but even for the people who are paying for it, because you now get worse guaranteed latency. And of course, for the people who don't buy it, they obviously get worse stuff. And it's very expensive, and now you have to bill for it. And oh, by the way, no one has ever done quality of service across networks, because the carriers, A, don't trust each other, and B, want to be paid for it, and nobody wants to pay for it. So, I mean, we can talk all about the potential disaster that's coming, but is it a realistic disaster? Or, when people say, wow, there's no one to pay for it, no one wants to pay for it, and there's no benefit, would it actually be deployed? And this is actually for anyone who's got ISP experience either.
Well, if your conclusion is correct, the FCC can just delete the 677,000 comments it's received in its proceeding and I don't think that the results of using prioritization results in worse service. And I would point out that there are aspects of the network that are prioritized and have always been prioritized. For instance, routing tables are prioritized and always had been, because if the routers don't get the routing tables, the internet doesn't work. But your fundamental question is correct, which is that we have not had any large-scale implementation of quality of service to date. There are both business questions, maintaining prioritization across networks, and questions of economics. Would people really find them valuable and pay for it? My view is one of the biggest reasons we have none of it is that most of the ISPs are afraid to do it, because they don't want to invest money in a service that a regulator will turn around and say they're not allowed to offer, and then they'll have all this sunk costs that will be lost and no way to recoup their investment. I think that's, you know, a significant challenge if you're an ISP today, thinking about offering some very forward-leaning services that are out there. If they may be illegal a year from now, why sink the money into it? I would much prefer to see whether there is a market there. We could discover that it may be a very small market for a very small number of applications. It might be a medium-sized market, or it might be something that the general public wants for certain things, particularly as they become more and more involved and dependent on web applications. And I think it would be nice to be in a world where that was encouraged, maybe looked over by regulators, but encouraged by regulators rather than discouraged.
Yeah, it may well be that the market is small. One point I would make is I think there are other flavors of prioritization that we're seeing emerge. I think the sort of sponsored data zero rating phenomenon is a way of marking certain service with respect to the cost to the consumer as lower cost. And that is a form of discrimination, if not priority on the wire. And also, I don't think that the lack of a market means that regulators should not be looking at the issue and stepping in on the issue of prioritization. First, because we do see evidence that the carriers are interested in pursuing the market, and we have seen some examples of the discriminatory behavior that we're concerned about as advocates for net neutrality. Second, because if the market does emerge, and you've sort of looking at market conditions 10, 15 years from now, you see a web of these sort of deals and promises and prioritized services that looks much different than the open internet we have to say today. The harm to consumer choice, to innovation at the distant edge of the network may already have been done, and that much harder to sort of roll back from as a regulatory matter. So I think that there is enough risk that it is worth regulatory attention.
Thank you. I think, do we have a question from one of our remote participants? If we could bring one of the roaming mics down, that would be great, and Jill can read out the question for us. Thank you.
Hey, Mike Nelson of Microsoft, I believe, asks, could you talk more about how regulators would force more transparency about prioritization and blocking?
That's a great question. The transparency piece is an important one that we haven't discussed today. I think it's important, at least in the US perspective, the transparency rules from 2010 remain in effect. I've not seen a lot of intention into how well that they're working, but the FCC has proposed to improve them, or to improve is a matter of opinion, but to add to them, specifically on the congestion and interconnection point. So I think improvements in sort of improvements in public understanding or FCC understanding of what congestion looks like and what the pressure points are and what the nature of those relationships are, so the nature of the business relationship across a congested link, I think could go a long way, both in sort of revealing bad practice, but also in educating the FCC and advocates and others in terms of what steps are necessary to ensure the functioning internet.
Yeah, I agree. I think transparency is a very helpful tool because it allows experts to look at what's going on to verify whether they think practices are good or bad, or understand them to the extent that they can debate that point or not. I do think that when we think about transparency, we should also think about whether we're making requirements that provide benefits or not in the process. I just would refer all of us in this country, at least, who are familiar with all the banking transparency rules. It seems I get something in the mail from my bank and my credit card and my mortgage provider constantly advising me of some minor change in their privacy policy or some other policy, which I didn't understand in the first place. I usually gets filed circularly without being opened, and really isn't providing benefits. So I think we just need to make sure we have a balance between providing information and making it available about how they're operating their network, what they are doing and what they are not doing, versus sort of forcing it as an affirmative requirement out to the world, because I think that's where a lot of the value gets lost. Its availability is what matters.
Right.
Was there any last closing comments that either of you wanted to briefly make?
I guess I would just say that the biggest challenge, I think, for everyone in this debate on net neutrality, no matter what your point of view is on it, is really there's a lot of painful details here. And what is happening politically in this country, around the world, is it's becoming a slogan debate. That has a lot to do with ideology or a lot to do with just some gut level points of view that are not tied into the actual technology, the actual services, and the way it's being used. And so I think we could all benefit in almost every instance from being more detailed and more specific about what we are and aren't doing and why. And I think if we do that, we'll come up with much better results at the end.
I would agree. It is a very technical topic, and it is always amazing to me when it sort of rises to popularity. And I agree with Jeff that engagement with the details can lead to a better result. I mean, often when you see this sort of rhetorical battle, you know, no prioritization, Title II never banned all prioritization, that sort of rhetoric, you lose the sort of what actually you're trying to accomplish. I don't think that net neutrality is a ban on all forms of prioritized access. I think that there's a role for specialized services. I think there's a role for sort of user-directed priority to the extent that that technology develops and that market develops. And so I think stepping back or digging in, to whichever metaphor, and engaging with the details is a very important part of it. The only other thing that I would add is that I'm very sorry that we didn't get to hear, particularly from Grace, because as I said, the zero rating issue and the sort of developing economy issue is an important one that I think is not talked about often enough in this forum, and I personally feel like I don't know enough, and I would love to know more.
Well, I know ISOC DC is planning on doing some future events, and so maybe that'll be in the future to have Grace come back and talk on some of that. I want to thank you both so much, Andrew and Jeff. This is really great, and I really want to thank the audience as well. Your participation was really, really great. Really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you.